My parents stole my identity to save my golden child sister. What I did next destroyed everything. Growing up, it was clear that my sister Jessica was the star of the family. She wasn't just mom and dad's favorite. They practically revolved around her. From the moment she was born, she was the golden child, the one they pinned all their hopes and dreams on. I wasn't neglected, exactly, but there was no mistaking the difference in how we were treated. Jessica was always the loud, outgoing one, the kind of person who could walk into a room and have everyone's attention within minutes. Mom and Dad loved to gush about how driven and special she was. Meanwhile, I was the quieter sibling, the one who kept my head down and tried not to make waves. If Jessica was a fireworks show, I was the flashlight you pull out in a power outage. Useful, but not exactly exciting. I didn't resent her for it. Not at first, anyway. It wasn't Jessica's fault that our parents put her on a pedestal. And to her credit, she wasn't a bad sister growing up. She could be bossy, sure, but she was also fiercely protective of me when it mattered. I loved her, even if I sometimes wished I could have a fraction of the attention she got. The favoritism was small at first. Jessica got the bigger bedroom, the fancier birthday parties, and the lion's share of praise for things like bringing home a decent report card or landing a spot on the cheerleading team. Meanwhile, I was the independent one, the easy child who didn't need as much attention because I was so good at taking care of myself. By the time we were teenagers, the gap between us had grown into a chasm. When Jessica wanted to go on a summer trip to Europe with her friends, Mom and Dad dipped into their savings to make it happen. When I asked for help with my school field trip to D.C., they told me it was too expensive and that I should learn to save for things that matter. Even so, I kept my resentment in check. What was the point of making waves? Jessica had always been their favorite, and nothing I said or did was going to change that. The real shift happened when Jessica graduated college with a degree in business. She had big dreams, of course. She was going to be an entrepreneur, a CEO, a trailblazer. And Mom and Dad were more than happy to fund her ambition. Jessica's plan was to open a boutique clothing store, a high-end, exclusive brand that she was convinced would be the next big thing in fashion. Never mind that we lived in a mid-sized town with no real market for that kind of thing. Jessica believed in her vision, and that was all Mom and Dad needed to hear. To fund her dream, they took out a second mortgage on the house. I remember the day they told me, sitting around the dinner table like it was some grand family announcement. "This is an investment in Jessica's future," Mom said, practically glowing with pride. "She's going to put our family on the map." Dad chimed in, his voice full of confidence. "It's a risk, sure, but you have to take risks for greatness. Jessica's got the drive to make it work." I wanted to ask why they hadn't taken a risk on me, why they hadn't offered to help with my college expenses when I'd been struggling to make ends meet. But I didn't. What would have been the point? I knew how that conversation would go. They'd tell me I was practical, that I didn't need their help because I was so capable. So, I swallowed my frustration and focused on my own life. At first, it seemed like Jessica's business might actually take off. She had a sleek storefront in the trendiest part of town, a perfectly curated Instagram page, and a constant flow of influencers who came to take selfies in her shop. Mom and Dad couldn't have been prouder. They bragged to everyone who would listen about their entrepreneur daughter, basking in the glow of her success. But the cracks started to show almost immediately. Jessica had overestimated how many people in our town were willing to pay luxury prices for her clothes. She blew through her budget in record time, overspending on inventory, decor, and a marketing campaign that cost more than it brought in. The business was hemorrhaging money, but Mom and Dad refused to see it. When Jessica asked for more help, they didn't hesitate. They took out a third mortgage on the house, funneling even more money into her dream. "This is just a bump in the road," Dad said when I questioned them about it. "Every great business has challenges at the start." But it wasn't just a bump. Jessica's boutique was a sinking ship, and everyone except my parents could see it. Over the next year, things went from bad to worse. Customers trickled out, staff quit, and Jessica started pulling ridiculous stunts, like hosting exclusive VIP events, to try to salvage the business. Nothing worked. Meanwhile, I was in my second year of college, juggling part-time jobs and a grueling engineering course load. Every penny I made went toward tuition and rent, and every free moment was spent studying. I didn't have time for distractions, or for the constant updates from Mom and Dad about how hard Jessica was working to turn things around. When the boutique finally closed its doors, I wasn't surprised. Jessica was devastated, of course. Mom and Dad were crushed too, not because they'd lost so much money, but because they felt like they'd let her down. For a while, I thought that was the end of it. I thought they'd finally learn their lesson, that they'd stop enabling Jessica's bad decisions and focus on rebuilding their own financial stability. I was wrong. One evening, as I sat at the kitchen table with my textbooks spread out in front of me, Mom and Dad called me into the living room. Their faces were serious, and I immediately knew something was wrong. "We need to talk," Mom said, her tone heavy. What came next left me speechless. They were drowning in debt. 3 mortgages, credit cards maxed out, savings completely drained. And now they wanted me to quit college, come home, and get a full-time job to help save the family. I sat frozen on the couch, staring at Mom and Dad as their words sank in. Quit college? Drop everything I'd worked so hard for? It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. "We wouldn't ask if it wasn't serious," Mom said, her voice trembling. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, and she looked at me with watery eyes that I recognized all too well, her martyr look. Dad leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "We're in a tough spot, kiddo. The bank's breathing down our necks, and we're running out of options." I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, I replayed their request in my mind, over and over. They wanted me to quit college, the dream I had been fighting tooth and nail to achieve, so I could bail them out of the mess they had created. And it wasn't just any mess. It was a mess born from their blind devotion to Jessica, their golden child, their hope for the future. The same Jessica who was conveniently absent from this conversation, probably off sulking about her failed boutique while I was being roped into cleaning up her disaster. "We've sacrificed so much for both of you," Mom continued, her voice trembling with emotion. "It's time for us to lean on you a little. That's what family does." The guilt hit like a punch to the gut. That was their ace up their sleeve. Always had been. They knew how to phrase things just right, how to frame their requests as acts of love and unity. But this wasn't about family. This was about them refusing to face the consequences of their choices. I finally found my voice. "What about Jessica?" I asked, my tone sharper than I intended. Mom flinched and Dad's jaw tightened. "What about her?" Mom said, "She's already devastated. Losing her business, it crushed her. She's in no position to help right now." I laughed bitterly. "But I'm supposed to throw away my education, my future, so you can protect her from reality?" Dad's expression darkened. "That's not fair," he said. "We're not asking you to give up forever. Just put things on hold for a little while. Help us get back on our feet." "Put things on hold?" I repeated, my voice rising. "Do you know how hard I've worked to get where I am? Do you have any idea what it would mean to drop out now?" I could feel the anger bubbling up, threatening to spill over. For years, I had kept quiet, swallowing my resentment every time Jessica got their unconditional support while I was left to fend for myself. But this was too much. Mom's tears started falling, and she reached for Dad's hand. "We're not trying to hurt you," she said, "but we're desperate. We thought you'd understand. You're always so practical, so responsible. We need you to help us, just this once." There it was, the familiar refrain. I was the practical one, the responsible one, the one who could be counted on to clean up everyone else's mess. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my emotions in check. "Have you asked Jessica to help?" "She's already trying," Mom said quickly. "She's looking for a new job, but you know how the market is. It's not easy." I wanted to scream. Jessica hadn't worked a single day since her boutique closed. She wasn't trying anything except to avoid responsibility, and they were letting her get away with it again. "Do you even hear yourselves?" I asked, my voice trembling with frustration. "You're asking me to give up everything, and she doesn't have to do a thing? How is that fair?" Mom's face crumpled, and Dad let out a heavy sigh. "We're not playing favorites," he said. "This isn't about Jessica versus you. It's about keeping the family afloat. If we lose the house, that's on you." I interrupted, my anger finally spilling over. "You're the ones who took out 3 mortgages. You're the ones who poured everything into Jessica's boutique. And now you expect me to pay the price for your decisions." The room fell silent, the weight of my words hanging heavy in the air. Mom wiped her tears, her expression shifting to something colder. "You've always had a chip on your shoulder about Jessica," she said quietly. "But this isn't the time to hold grudges. We're asking for your help because we love you, because we know you're strong enough to do what needs to be done." I shook my head, standing up from the couch. "This isn't love," I said. "This is manipulation. You made your choices. Now you have to live with them." Their shocked expressions followed me as I left the room, my heart pounding with a mix of anger and defiance. For years, I had let them treat me like the backup plan, the safety net. But not anymore. That night, I lay awake in bed, replaying the conversation in my mind. Part of me felt guilty for standing up to them. They were my parents after all. But a bigger part of me felt something else, something I hadn't felt in years. Freedom. For the first time, I was putting myself first. And no matter how much guilt they tried to heap on me, I wasn't going to let them take that away. The morning after the confrontation, I felt like a dam had finally burst. For years, I kept my frustrations bottled up, quietly accepting my role as the responsible one, while Jessica basked in the glow of being the favorite. But the conversation with my parents had pushed me to a breaking point. I wasn't just angry at their request. I was angry at the entire dynamic that had brought us to this moment. As I went about my day, I couldn't shake the weight of their words. They had framed their request as a desperate act of love, a plea for me to step up and save the family. But the truth was far more selfish. They weren't asking me to help for the sake of the family. They were asking me to sacrifice everything for the sake of Jessica. This pattern wasn't new. It had been there my entire life, woven into the fabric of our family dynamic. Jessica had always been the center of their attention, the shining star whose ambitions were praised and whose mistakes were forgiven. When she succeeded, they celebrated her brilliance. When she failed, they bent over backward to shield her from the fallout. I, on the other hand, had always been the safety net, the dependable one, the quiet one. My successes were acknowledged in passing, but never with the same enthusiasm. My struggles were brushed aside, dismissed with comments like, "You're so practical, you'll figure it out." It wasn't just favoritism. It was a complete abdication of responsibility when it came to me. They assumed I would always land on my feet, that I didn't need their support because I was strong enough to handle things on my own. But now, they were asking me to do the impossible, to give up the life I was building, the future I had worked so hard for, to clean up a mess I hadn't created. The thought of quitting college made my stomach churn. It wasn't just about the degree or the career I wanted to pursue. It was about everything that degree represented. It was proof that I could break free from the cycle, that I could carve out a life that was mine, independent of their expectations. My parents didn't see it that way. To them, college was a luxury, something that could be postponed or abandoned entirely if the family's needs demanded it. But they didn't understand what quitting would mean for me. I was on a scholarship, one I had worked tirelessly to earn. If I dropped out now, I wouldn't just lose my spot at school. I'd lose the financial aid that made it possible for me to attend in the first place. There would be no going back. As I grappled with these thoughts, I couldn't help but think about Jessica. While I was juggling classes and part-time jobs, scraping together enough to pay for textbooks and rent, she had been chasing a dream that was doomed from the start. And when it all fell apart, she had retreated, leaving Mom and Dad to deal with the fallout. Jessica's silence in the weeks following her boutique's closure spoke volumes. She wasn't making any effort to contribute, to take responsibility for the mess she had helped create. Instead, she was likely sitting in her apartment, wallowing in self-pity while Mom and Dad scrambled to keep the house. It wasn't just frustrating, it was infuriating. But I knew confronting her wouldn't change anything. Jessica had spent her entire life being insulated from consequences, and my parents had only reinforced that behavior. They had enabled her to believe that she was special, that the rules didn't apply to her, and that someone would always be there to pick up the pieces. And now they expected me to be that someone. I couldn't do it anymore. As the days turned into weeks, I focused on my own routine. My schedule was grueling. Early mornings, late nights, and endless hours spent studying or working. But it was my routine, one I had built for myself. Every class I attended, every shift I worked was a step toward the future I wanted, one where I wouldn't have to rely on anyone else. Still, the tension with my parents lingered. They called frequently, leaving voicemails filled with subtle guilt trips and veiled pleas. Their messages always followed the same script. A reminder of the family's struggles, a comment about how we're all in this together, and a carefully worded hint that they still hoped I would reconsider. I ignored most of them, choosing instead to focus on what I could control. I reviewed my finances obsessively, making sure I had enough saved to cover tuition and rent for the next semester. I started looking into internships, hoping to secure a position that would set me up for success after graduation. But even as I moved forward, I couldn't escape the weight of their expectations. The breaking point came one evening when I checked the mail and found a letter addressed to me. At first, I assumed it was something routine, a bill, maybe, or an update from my school. But as I opened the envelope, my heart sank. It was from the bank. The letter detailed the financial status of my parents' mortgage, missed payments, mounting penalties, and a warning about the possibility of foreclosure. But what truly shocked me was the revelation buried in the fine print. My name was listed as a co-signer on the third mortgage. They had used my name. I felt a wave of disbelief and anger crash over me as I read the letter again and again, hoping I had misunderstood. But there it was in black and white. My parents had taken out the mortgage in my name, tying me to their debt without my knowledge or consent. It was a betrayal unlike anything I had experienced before. For years, I had accepted their favoritism, their refusal to treat me with the same care and attention they gave Jessica. I had worked tirelessly to build a life for myself, independent of their influence. But now, they had crossed a line I couldn't ignore. They hadn't just asked for my help. They had taken it, without permission, without even telling me. The letter from the bank felt like a gut punch. I sat there, staring at the words on the page, hoping that somehow I had misread them. But no amount of rereading changed the reality. My name was listed as a co-signer on the third mortgage my parents had taken out to fund Jessica's failed business. I couldn't wrap my head around it. Co-signing wasn't a small, casual thing. It required consent, paperwork, signatures. My parents had gone out of their way to forge this connection, dragging me into their financial disaster without so much as a conversation. The betrayal burned deeper than I could have imagined. For years, I had swallowed my resentment, telling myself that their favoritism toward Jessica was harmless, just an unfortunate dynamic I'd learned to live with. But this was different. This wasn't just about Jessica. It was about me. They had crossed a line, one that threatened to derail everything I had worked for. I felt trapped, anger boiling beneath the surface as I tried to process the implications. This wasn't just their debt anymore, it was mine too. If they defaulted on their payments, it would ruin my credit, my future, my ability to build the life I'd been fighting so hard for. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I went through the motions of attending classes and my part-time job, but my mind was elsewhere, replaying the betrayal over and over. My parents hadn't even mentioned the mortgage during our confrontation. They had framed their request for help as a plea, a desperate last resort. But in reality, they had already dragged me into their mess without giving me a choice. When I got home that evening, I did something I had never done before. I started looking into legal advice. I wasn't sure if there was anything I could do, but I had to try. The thought of being tied to my parents' financial disaster was unbearable, and I wasn't going to let them ruin my future without a fight. As I scrolled through forums and articles about co-signing fraud, a nagging thought crept into my mind. This couldn't have been an accident. My parents were careless with their finances, sure, but they weren't stupid. They must have known exactly what they were doing when they added my name to that mortgage. The question was, why? I stayed up late that night, combing through the details of the letter and everything I knew about the situation. The more I thought about it, the more the pieces started to fit together. Jessica wasn't just the golden child. She was the linchpin of their entire identity. They had built their lives around the idea that she was destined for greatness, that her success would validate all the sacrifices they had made for her. But when her boutique failed, that dream shattered. And instead of facing reality, they doubled down, trying to keep the illusion alive. By co-signing the mortgage in my name, they had bought themselves more time to avoid the inevitable at my expense. What bothered me most was how calculated it all felt. They hadn't asked for my help outright because they knew I would say no. Instead, they had gone behind my back, exploiting my trust and my identity to protect the fantasy they had built around Jessica. The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. But my anger wasn't just directed at my parents. It was also aimed at myself. I had spent years letting them take advantage of my silence, my willingness to put others first. I had let them get away with treating me like a backup plan, the safety net they could rely on whenever Jessica's ambitions went up in flames. That silence ended now. The next morning, I called the bank. My heart was pounding as I explained the situation, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and nerves. The representative on the other end of the line listened patiently, but her response made my stomach drop. The loan was legitimate, she said, and my name was listed as a consenting party. If I wanted to contest it, I would need to provide proof that I hadn't signed the documents. Proof. I spent the rest of the day digging through my files, looking for anything that might help me. But before I could make any headway, my phone buzzed with a notification, a text message from Jessica. She never texted me. Her message was short but cryptic. "I think we need to talk. It's about Mom and Dad." I stared at the message, my mind racing with possibilities. What could Jessica possibly have to say? Was she finally ready to take responsibility for the mess she had created? Or was this just another attempt to shift the blame? Part of me didn't want to respond. I was tired of being dragged into their chaos, tired of being the one who always had to fix things. But the curiosity gnawed at me. Jessica knew something she was finally willing to share. With a mix of reluctance and suspicion, I agreed to meet her the next day. When I arrived at the coffee shop, Jessica was already waiting for me, her face drawn and pale. She looked different, less polished, more vulnerable. It was a stark contrast to the confident, self-assured sister I had grown up with. As I sat down across from her, she slid a folded piece of paper across the table. Her hands were shaking. "This is bigger than you think," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The paper was a photocopy of a legal document, a power of attorney form. My name was on it, but the signature wasn't mine. The discovery of the forged power of attorney document was a turning point. Until then, I had felt angry and betrayed, but part of me had still clung to the hope that my parents' actions, however misguided, were born out of desperation. But the forgery proved otherwise. This wasn't a mistake or a moment of poor judgment. It was premeditated, calculated fraud. They had looked at me, their child, and decided I was just another resource to exploit in their quest to preserve Jessica's image and avoid the consequences of their own choices. The realization hit me like a tidal wave, drowning any lingering guilt or obligation I felt toward them. Jessica's admission left me conflicted. She seemed genuinely remorseful, and for the first time, she wasn't trying to shift blame or deflect responsibility. She had even taken a risk by showing me the document, knowing it would expose the depth of our parents' betrayal. Still, it was hard to reconcile her sudden honesty with the years of selfishness that had led us to this moment. I filed the power of attorney document away carefully and contacted a lawyer the very next day. Sitting in the lawyer's office, I laid out everything: the forged document, the co-signed mortgage, and my parents' manipulation. The lawyer's face remained calm and professional, but their eyes betrayed a flicker of shock as I explained how far my parents had gone. Their advice was clear: I needed to act quickly. The mortgage wasn't just a financial liability. It was a ticking time bomb that could destroy my credit and my future if left unchallenged. The lawyer assured me that the forgery gave me strong grounds to dispute the mortgage, but it would take time and persistence to untangle myself from the legal mess my parents had created. Over the following weeks, I devoted every spare moment to the fight. I filed formal disputes with the bank, challenging the validity of the mortgage and presenting the forged power of attorney as evidence. I submitted a revocation of any supposed permissions my parents had over my financial affairs, effectively cutting off their ability to use my name for any future loans or legal agreements. The process was grueling. Every email, Every phone call with the bank felt like dragging myself through quicksand. But I kept going, fueled by the knowledge that this was the only way to protect myself. As the legal battle unfolded, I finally confronted my parents. The meeting was tense, held in the sterile confines of the lawyer's office to ensure that everything was above board. My parents looked exhausted, their faces etched with the stress of months of financial strain. But any sympathy I might have felt evaporated the moment I presented the forged document. My mother's reaction was predictable: tears, apologies, and pleas for understanding. She claimed they had been desperate, that they had felt there was no other way to keep the family afloat. My father, on the other hand, tried to justify their actions, framing the forgery as a necessary evil. "You're strong," he said, his voice steady but hollow. "We knew you'd find a way to fix this. You always do." Their words only deepened the wound. They didn't see what they had done as a betrayal. They saw it as an inevitability, as if my reliability somehow justified their actions. It was a chilling realization, one that solidified my decision to break away from them entirely. I left the meeting without looking back. Over the next few months, the fallout from their actions became impossible to ignore. The bank invalidated the mortgage after verifying the forgery, forcing my parents to take full responsibility for the debt. Without my name to bolster their credit, they couldn't keep up with the payments on their 3 mortgages. The house went into foreclosure shortly after, leaving them scrambling to find somewhere else to live. Jessica, to her credit, finally started taking steps to clean up her part in the mess. She got a full-time job, not the glamorous, high-paying career she had always envisioned, but honest work that helped chip away at the debts she had helped create. It wasn't enough to fix everything, but it was the first time I'd ever seen her take real responsibility for her actions. Despite her efforts, the damage to our relationship was irreparable. Jessica had been a passive participant in the forgery, and while she hadn't directly orchestrated it, her willingness to let our parents shield her from the consequences of her choices made her complicit. Cutting ties with my parents was one of the hardest decisions I'd ever made, but it was also one of the most necessary. For years, I had allowed them to use me as a crutch, to lean on my independence and reliability, while lavishing their attention and resources on Jessica. Breaking away meant acknowledging that I couldn't save them, that their choices and the consequences of those choices were theirs to bear alone. In the years that followed, I rebuilt my life piece by piece. I graduated college, landed a stable job in engineering, and moved to a new city where I could finally start fresh. The shadow of their betrayal lingered, but with time, it began to fade. What surprised me most was how freeing it felt to be on my own. For the first time, I wasn't living under the weight of their expectations or their manipulation. I could make decisions based on what I wanted, not what I thought would earn their approval or keep the peace. Occasionally, I'd hear updates about my parents through mutual acquaintances. They had downsized to a small apartment, their finances still precarious, but no longer tied to me. Jessica, remarkably, seemed to have turned a corner. She had paid off a significant portion of her debts, and had even started rebuilding her relationship with some of the friends she had alienated during her boutique's collapse. As for me, I didn't regret my decision to cut ties. It wasn't easy. There were moments when I missed the idea of family, the version of it I had always wished for but never truly had. But I had learned to accept that some relationships, no matter how deeply rooted, aren't worth preserving if they come at the cost of your own well-being. In the end, I realized that my parents' betrayal had given me something invaluable: the clarity to see my own worth. For years, I had been the backup plan, the safety net, the practical one who didn't need help or recognition. But breaking free from their control allowed me to redefine myself, to build a life where I was more than just an afterthought. Their choices could have ruined me, but instead, they became the catalyst for my independence. And as I stood on the balcony of my new apartment, watching the city lights shimmer against the night sky, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: peace.